I am back with another video. It has been a minute, so I apologise. Video went to the bottom of the pile. Work and life and kids and everything's just kind of got in the way. But after sharing my recent project on LinkedIn, there was quite a few requests to make a video around my process and how I created the project. So here we are. And I will pre-warn you, it will probably be a fairly long one. So yeah, I'm going to have fun editing that. So to give a bit of context, this project was another micro learning. I've done a lot of micro learnings on Rise recently, and I've been really enjoying creating these kind of illustrated Rise courses. But I wanted to step away and take it back into Storyline, mainly because not everybody wants to use Rise. Some people prefer Storyline. Sometimes content suits Storyline better. Obviously, with Storyline, you've got a wider range of interactions. I would argue that you can make things more accessible with Storyline than with Rise as well. So I wanted to see if I could create this really kind of impactful micro learning in Storyline that has that kind of continuous feel that you can create with Rise. So obviously I knew that this was going to involve creating some kind of like custom transition between slides. So we've got our basic ones like fade, you can do like wipe, like move to the side, push, that's the one. You can do kind of basic ones like that. But I wanted it to feel almost like you're not breaking between slides. So there's no kind of obvious jump. Now, as I always go on about and will continue to go on about, you can create this kind of effect using the morph transition in PowerPoint. But what I wanted to be different about this project is that I didn't want to be importing any external video or assets into Storyline to create the effect. I wanted this to be very accessible. I didn't want it to impact the learner experience. So the problem with using lots of video is you can slow down the loading time. So I wanted it to be very kind of time and cost effective as well, something that I could literally apply to a live client project and actually use. So that was one of the challenges with this. Now, a few weeks before sort of starting this little project, I did a mini version where I took 3 slides and played about with how I could create these custom transitions to show how these 3 slides were connected. And that went really well. And I really loved the outcome of that. It was really fluid and it took no time at all to set up as well. So now that I knew I could achieve it, I wanted to try and apply it to something a bit longer. So in this case, it was a 10-minute micro learning. And to do so, I started in PowerPoint. I did a whole mock-up in PowerPoint before going into Storyline. So today we are going to explore that project. I'll talk you through the PowerPoint, and then we'll go into Storyline and we'll have a look at the back end and kind of the animations and the motion paths and all that kind of stuff. But if you haven't watched any of my videos before, or you don't follow me on LinkedIn, quick introduction. My name is Emma Berry. I am an e-learning developer and an instructional designer on a one-woman mission to kind of push the boundaries of the software that we're using to create e-learning and to just be as creative as possible to create things that look amazing but also function well and are accessible. So let's get into it and jump into PowerPoint. Now, for this e-learning, I did something that I don't usually do, and I fully mocked this up in PowerPoint. So I always kind of plan the look and feel of my e-learnings, and I'll sort of start to source imagery that I feel is going to be relevant. But I very rarely sort of plan out the design of an e-learning to this degree before getting into Storyline. Usually the kind of layout of the slides comes quite organically as I kind of develop them. But because this one was focusing on transitions and animations, I really wanted to plan it so that when I got into the build stage, I'd kind of done all the thinking about where I wanted like the content to sit on the page, so I could focus on programming in those transitions. So the good thing about PowerPoint is that we already have the morph transition in PowerPoint. So If I just preview the slide, you can see how it fluidly moves to the next one. And the good thing about this was that I was able to move things around and change things on the slide, and then add the transition, see how it performed, and then if I didn't like it, could move stuff around again. So if I was doing this in Storyline, obviously I'd then be moving things like motion paths, potentially states, triggers, all of that kind of thing. So it was so much easier to do that kind of pre-thinking and that playing in PowerPoint before I'd even touched Storyline. So I fully mocked this whole micro-learning out, and you can see kind of like with these two thumbnails here, where the slides link in together. And I tested out all of the transitions with Storyline in mind, though. So this is probably fairly simple in terms of what the morph transition in PowerPoint can do. But when I was doing this, I had to constantly be thinking, okay, I'm going to be doing this in Storyline, and Storyline doesn't have this functionality. So I want it to look slick and to look nice, but it's got to be achievable at the same time and not too time consuming, because I kind of wanted to create this as something that could be realistically made as a live project for a client or within a company. So I wanted it to be achievable and actually sort of cost and time effective to make as well. So it is fairly simple. So here was all my slides, all mocked up, ready to go. Now, somebody commented on my LinkedIn about why didn't I just transfer the PowerPoint straight into Storyline? And the reason for this is there would have been no point really, because Storyline would have just knocked all of the transitions out anyway, because it doesn't have the morph. And a lot of these elements here, as you'll see, these kind of separate elements, are the things that I was going to animate in Storyline. So I was importing them as separate things anyway and moving them and doing whatever. So actually I kind of found it easier just to use this almost like a blueprint, and obviously with my two screens, to just look back and forth and to just mimic it. Okay, so that's kind of the first thing. If you're going to copy or replicate this idea or have a go yourself, is I would really recommend doing a mock-up in PowerPoint first and getting those animations exactly how you want them to before you move into Storyline. Cool. So let's get into Storyline now and see how I put it all together. Okay, so I apologise in advance. This is probably going to be quite a long video because there's quite a lot to cover, and I apologise to future me that's going to have to edit this and cut it down and make sense of it. So let's have a look then. So we are in Storyline, and you can see I've got all of my slides in a nice, neat little linear fashion. And this is my first slide, my welcome slide. So really, there's nothing really that remarkable about this first slide, to be honest. You can see it kind of mimics that PowerPoint that I've done. I've applied a little bit of Storyline magic to the button, so actually made it a usable button. I did have an emphasis animation on this one, but it kept going really weird, and it was doing the emphasis and not when I wanted it to, so I took it off. And when I put a first kind of draft of this on LinkedIn, I received some really, really helpful feedback from other people in the industry about having sort of too much animated on the slide. And that was a really good point. And actually, when I reviewed the course again, I did find that actually it was almost too animated. So I simplified things a lot when doing a kind of like second round of review on this. So my first transition is moving from this welcome slide into this slide here. And you can see I've got this really large beige shape. Now, if I go into my animations, you can see that the actual animation is incredibly simple. It is just a motion path which moves this beige shape from in the corner here to just a little bit further into the slide. And if I pull up my timeline, you'll see that most of this is controlled by the timeline and cue points. And this is pretty much what is going to form the basis of making this whole thing run. So instead of adding lots of complicated triggers and layers and whatever, it's literally just the first lot of animations plays, you pause your timeline, and then the user or the learner triggers something to make this timeline carry on. So in this slide, it's that begin button. So let's have a look at our triggers panel. So we've got our first trigger, which is that the timeline pauses on this slide when it reaches cue point 1, which is here. And then it jumps to the next slide. So our what is psychological safety when the timeline ends on this slide. So it doesn't jump by the user clicking begin. It jumps when the timeline finishes. So to get that timeline to carry on once it has paused, the learner has to click our begin button, which resumes the timeline. And what this also does is sets this motion path to move as well. So when the learner clicks begin, this beige shape will move. And once that beige shape has finished moving, we'll jump to the next slide. So let's just preview these two slides so we can see this kind of in action and see how it's going to go. Now, motion paths are not my friend. I really don't enjoy using them. So a lot of these animations are actually really simple and really short because, yeah, there's just something about motion paths. They're fiddly and I don't like to layer too many of them. Okay, so here's our first slide. We've got our begin button, which I storyline-ified, made it animated and whatever. And if we click begin, you can see there's our beige shape that moves. And then we jump to the next slide. And you can see this happening with our menu panel here as well. You can see when that transition happens. So if I just jump back to our welcome slide, keep an eye on this menu here, and you can see that moment when the slides jump. So this moves, and then it jumps to our next one. But because we've got this kind of fluid transition of one timeline ending and the other one beginning, you don't notice that jump between the two slides unless you had this open and you were watching it. Okay, so that's kind of our first really nice fluid animation. And the next question that I'll probably get is, how did I kind of match these up? And that was probably the fiddliest bit, was just making sure that where this ended matched up with where this shape then sat. And to do that, all I did was copy this shape over with its motion path. And then if you click on the motion path, it shows you kind of in a real translucent way where it's going to land. And then I just matched up. So I just copied over another version of the shape, deleted the animation on it, and just matched it up. And that took a little bit of trial and error to get that alignment right. Because even the tiniest little misalignment, you can notice it because it jumps. So that did take me probably the longest bit, really, is just making sure that pixel perfect they were lined up. Another thing to point out is this huge box. So this actual shape that appears on the screen isn't actually that big. It's sort of this little bit here. But we've got all of this extra space on this shape. And this is where you need that little bit of pre-planning. So I knew that I was going to be moving the shape around the screen and bringing it in and moving it sort of across. So I needed to make sure that I had enough of this shape that it would cover the slide. So that's why we've got a lot of this extra space, essentially, is so that as it moves onto the slide, it's going to completely cover it, or cover the areas that I need it to. So you can see the actual animations of the elements on the slide are fairly simple. They're just float in or fade animations, which again is to keep the kind of cognitive load down and to speed up the loading and the entrance of the slide. You don't want people waiting ages for animations to finish before they can do what they actually need to do. So if I pull up the timeline, again, you can see we're following the exact same pattern. So everything animates in, and then we've got a cue point which pauses the timeline once the last thing finishes animating, which is our submit button, and then it pauses. Now, I don't tend to give people very much time before the timeline pauses, because you don't want people speed clicking through and then messing up all of your animations. Because if I clicked submit before the timeline had had a chance to pause, it would just carry on resuming, everything else would animate out, and then the slide would jump. So it's literally milliseconds that they've got after that submit button enters before the timeline pauses. And that submit button is our trigger to move on to the next slide. So by the time it's animated in, the timeline's already paused and they don't have time to sort of do that click, click, click through. So the difference with this one, transitioning into our next one, is that some things are staying on the screen. So with this slide, our welcome slide into slide 1.2, everything animated out of 1.2, our welcome slide, sorry, apart from this beige blob. So I faded out the text and the picture of the two women. Whereas with this one into this one, we're actually keeping the same man. We're keeping the beige blob, and we are keeping the title text and stuff as well. So actually there's not much moving between these two. So you'll see all we've got fading out is our submit button, our text entry, and the kind of the rectangle behind the text entry. So the animations here are really, really simple. There's no motion paths. There's no nothing else fancy. This animates out, and then we animate in this kind of teal blob. And again, it's bigger than our slide space, so that it's got enough space, enough room, I guess, to play with and to move it around the slide. And it's a simple, literally straight across motion path that just triggers when the slide starts, and it just moves into the slide. It's really, really simple. So if we preview these two slides now. Okay. So everything nicely kind of fades in. Let's just type in an answer so it'll let me move on. And if I click submit, you can see that just fades out really, really simple. And our blue kind of wavy shape then flies in. So that is another way you can kind of use these transitions. It doesn't have to be really kind of all singing or dancing, everything flying in and flying out and whatever. Just something simple like that that kind of indicates to the learner that they're on the same topic, but there's been a slight change. It's kind of that kind of, sort of subconscious, I guess, or kind of telling your brain that there's something different about this slide, but you're still, because the imagery is the same, we've kept the title, you're still working with the same subject matter. So this just flies in with one of Storyline's pre-done animations. And then this motion path here is for it moving off the slide. So you'll also see that we've got a blue rectangle, and this wipes to the, I think it's to the left, isn't it? Yeah, from right. And if I zoom back in, because it looks a bit mad, our slide space is only as big as this rectangle. So these sort of extra shapes are a lot bigger. And what this is set to do is wipe to the right as this blob moves. So they're timed in sync with each other. So that as that moves across the screen, that the rectangle behind them wipes in, and it looks as if this is kind of moving across and growing, I guess, like covering the whole screen, wiping it blue. Now with this shape, again, I could have added like an extra bit of rectangle here in that teal color and just had a motion path. But in this instance, I didn't do enough pre-planning on this slide, apparently. And I've also added a grow transition to this one so that as it moves across the motion path, it grows. And that just helps it cover the slide space quicker. So it's almost like doing a bit of a color wash, or like the fill tool, essentially, if you use like Photoshop. It's like a color fill. And then we transition into our first multiple choice question. Now, this is a really nice transition, which is the question into the answer. And this is probably one of my favourite ones of the whole course. So if I just preview it first, and then I'll talk through what we did. Thankfully, Storyline's playing ball with me today. It's actually loading quite quickly. Usually when I record videos, it takes ages and I have to fill the space with something. So again, really simple fade-in animations and flying on these two light bulbs. And they choose their answer, click submit, and we've created kind of the effect of these light bulbs sort of falling down and as the screen goes up. So it's almost like it being kind of stretched, I guess. So let's just do that again, just so we can see it. So everything comes in, we click submit, and it all falls down. So you're getting that illusion of moving down to see your feedback. And this, yeah, is probably my favourite transition of the whole micro learning. It's really smooth and it's a really nice way of displaying feedback without having to have the pop-up window, because obviously the pop-up sort of feedback window that comes up is really handy, but it is a bit boring. So this was a really nice way to maintain and carry on that kind of fluid transition without having to deal with layers as well. The feedback itself, so that that's right, or it would appear as not quite, I think, is just a variable that's based on this multiple choice question here. So if they get the answer wrong, it triggers the variable to read not quite instead of that's right. So it's so simple to set up. Okay, so let's have a look at how I actually set this up. So if I just grab our timeline again, and again, you can see the animations are fairly simple. These are fly-in, and we've got our motion path here, which will send this blob. I like the way I name my files, blob and block, very technical. It will send this beige blob going upwards, and it starts to put in motion that kind of scrolling down animation. So as I've gone through already, works exactly the same. All the animations come in. The submit button is our trigger, which is what will move the timeline on. It pauses once everything's gone in. The learner selects their answer. They click submit. And if we can see here, we've got all of my triggers, which are linked to that variable and what it should display feedback-wise on the next slide. So if question 1, which is this one, is correct, is value true, when the user clicks submit, then it then triggers the correct answer variable and makes it show correct answer feedback. So I won't go through all of those because that's kind of a different topic in itself, and we're just kind of focusing on the animations and everything now. So again, we've got our pause timeline on this slide when it reaches Q.1, and when the timeline ends, it jumps to slide feedback. So the only animation we've got that's more complex is this motion path. And if I click on it, you can see that it is literally just a straight up motion path. And that is it. I'll just go through how I sort of change the settings of the motion path as well, because this can sometimes impact the way they perform and the way they look. So I've got the duration as 1.5 seconds. This was just kind of my preference, and I felt it was fast enough that the learner wasn't kind of sat there thinking, okay, come on, this is taking ages. But it wasn't too fast that you kind of missed the animation itself. So if I go on path options, I've got direction set as none because I didn't want it to have that bouncy effect. I kind of want it to bounce back and then carry on, because this can also slow down the animations as well. So I just had it as none. And you don't need to do it like relative start point or anything, because this isn't moving in a unusual way, I guess. So again, the settings are really simple. So if we jump to the feedback one, essentially all we're doing is kind of reversing what we've just done on that previous slide. So that one goes up, and then on here we've got that same blob and block shape, and you can notice that that has no animations on it on this slide. So this again was an exercise in just matching things up, making sure that they're aligned, that this blob here is sitting where this one ends at the end of its motion path, so that when the slide transition over, this blob is already in the position it needs to be, and it doesn't move. And we have a beige rectangle, which if I move that one out of the way, you'll see that initially we get that teal background, and this beige rectangle is part of the next transition. So it can get a little bit confusing because you kind of have to layer on what the transition is on top of your slide that you're working on. So what I tended to do was build the slide first. So build out this kind of the image, the light bulbs, the text and everything. And then once I was happy with this and the way it was functioning, I then started to build the next transition into the next slide on top of this, because this is what's going to cover the slide space. So just quickly as well, the light bulbs, which we saw kind of falling down onto the screen, they are just a really simple fly-in animation, and it's flying from top, I believe. Yeah. Okay. So with this animation, again, it's a real simple pre-built one in Storyline. It's just a split animation. And this one happens right at the very end. So if you can see the timeline here, these fade out animations or exit animations happen first, and then this splits out to, again, kind of color wash the screen because the next slide has the same color background. And then we see this blue shape here morphs from our background shape. So I won't go through every single slide because each one has slightly different animations, and I could take you through every single one and how I did all of it, but it'll probably get a little bit repetitive. So the key things to kind of note really are, aside from the kind of planning stage and really planning what you want your interactions to be and your animations to be, is to keep things as simple as possible, really. You can kind of notice a common thread here that I've used a lot of really, really basic motion paths. It's just straight lines either to the side or up or down or whatever, that are triggered by our buttons here. Most things on the slide also have fairly simple animations. These are a fade in. And you can utilize what Storyline has as much as possible. So where I just want something to kind of come onto the screen, don't bother messing about with motion paths. Just use the fly in animation. So if I preview this slide here, you can see that if I click yes, that's the transition to the next slide. And that blue shape was just a fly in animation. So it doesn't have to be super complicated. You can make it pretty simple. And as a result of using a lot of storylines built in animations, this whole project only took me like a week, maybe even less than that, really, if I'd obviously been dedicating whole days to this, but this was done kind of bits at a time. I reckon if I'd dedicated kind of whole days to creating this, it would have taken me a few days. It's really simple, really quick. And that pre-planning meant that that build was smooth, and allowed me to have already made all those decisions and already kind of ironed out any problems. And there we go. There's not really much else to cover, I don't think. The rest of it's fairly simple. You can see where I've used these large shapes again. And it's okay to repeat things as well. I think with this, it's finding a focal point. It's the thing that you want to be leading the slide. So for me, it's these blobs. Obviously, I use a few kind of color wipes and things here and there as well. But for the most part, the things that are animating are these blobs. So that also creates a kind of sense of continuity. So people expect that's the thing that's going to be moving, and signaling that transition into the next topic or the next slide or whatever. So I think if you're going to do this, choose that one thing that's going to be your focal point. It's going to be the leader of the slides, and take the learner through them. And in the one that I did very similar to this a few weeks ago, I used almost like puzzle pieces, I guess, where it was two triangles that locked together to create an almost like shutter effect. And you can repeat that. So that could just be your transition. You could just repeat that over and over again if you wanted to. But what I like about kind of mixing it up but using the same shapes is that it feels different and it keeps things engaging, but it's not overly difficult. You're not kind of having to think up new and crazy ways to animate each slide. It might be just as simple as this blue blob here will animate from left, and then on the next one it might come from the top, for example. It can be as simple as that, and you can still have a really nice effect. So let's just view the entire project in its glory before we wrap this up. There we go. And I'm going to leave the menu open so that you can see how it moves through each slide. So we click begin. And there we have our lovely man animating. Click test. There we go. And you can see it jump then between the two slides. If I was being really picky, I'd probably say I could speed up the animation, the kind of fade out and fade in of this text, because that was a little bit slow, but I'm not going to bother changing it now. And then next again, you can see that wipes across and we get our question. And our feedback. Then we'll click next again. And you can see another way of kind of reducing the cognitive load is to keep some of the elements the same. So this picture of these two people is present for 3 slides. It moves in on one and then it stays there for a bit. And that again just kind of helps not only with the continuity of subject matter and showing the learner that you're kind of focusing on the same thing for a couple of slides, but it also just gives their eyes a bit of a break, gives their brain a little bit of a break. So they're having that focal point and everything is kind of coming in around it. And it focuses them in for a little bit. Okay. And I've got this exercise. And the really great thing about this is you can incorporate all the usual interactions and things you would in Storyline. So you can use multiple choice questions, you can use text entry boxes, you can use flashcards, you can use all the kind of like same interactions and same things you would use content-wise, just with these transitions. So in this instance, it's, the design isn't impairing or impacting the instructional design. This is kind of functional visual design that is going to support the content and not take away from it. And there we go, all done. So I really hope that's been helpful. And if you have any questions at all, then do drop them in the comments and I will get to them. But do have a go at this. I would love to see what you come up with.